So now we're going to move on. We've learned a little bit about DBI in general. We've learned about CBM and progress monitoring, how CBM can be used for progress monitoring. The next step is that we're going to talk a little bit about how to determine a student's present level of performance and how to set a goal for a student. So we're going to learn more about how to determine that baseline starting point and then how to set that goal. So here we are again with our framework from National Center for Intensive Intervention, that framework for data-based instruction. Now that you're able to select an appropriate CBM and administer and score that, our first step is to establish a present level of performance. So let's talk about that next. So in order to establish that PLEP, or present level of educational performance, we're going to administer 3 different probes or measures. Sometimes we call the CBM the different alternate forms. We call those probes. So it's important to remember in CBM, you're going to have many different forms of oral reading fluency, for instance. And each one of those captures the same skill, but it's a slightly different form. So a different story, a different set of letters or words. So for present level of performance, you're going to administer 3 of those measures or 3 of those probes within 24 hours. Many of these measures you could just give 3 back to back, especially if they're 1-minute measures. You could just give 3 right in a row. And then you're going to score those and use the median or middle score as the baseline. So for instance, if we had 12, 11, and 20 as our scores for the 3 different probes, our median would be 12. Good. If we have 15, 20, 17, okay, so you put those in order, rank order those from least to greatest, and our median is 17, okay? And then what would be the student's baseline if the student's scores on the initial 3 measures are 69, 71, and 73? Right? Rank order, least to greatest, and then the middle score is, good, 71, okay? It was right in the middle there. Just remember, don't get caught and take the average of these. We actually take the median score. Why do we take the median instead of the average? The median is less influenced by highs and lows, and we want to really sort of stabilize these scores. A student might have scored 10 or something initially and then goes on to score 20 on the 3rd probe. We want to sort of balance out and try to get the best approximation of where the student's at. And so the median isn't as heavily influenced by those sort of high and low scores. The average, a really high or really low score would really pull that average, but a median is less influenced. So that's why we take the median. Okay? So once we have that present level of performance, we're actually going to work to use that to set an ambitious long-term goal. We always say ambitious yet realistic, and I know those terms sort of seem a little counterintuitive, but we want to set an ambitious goal for students that they have to work hard to achieve. But we want it to be realistic enough where it provides good data to the teacher. That helps us know more about the effectiveness of our instruction. And so we're going to talk more about how to set that goal, some basics in goal setting. Okay, so remember, this is important, we want to set goals that help our students close the gap and catch up, not just maintain. So that's going to mean that sometimes we have to be more ambitious than perhaps we think the student can rise up to meet. But remember, when we set those expectations high, many times students rise up to meet those. So we want to be thinking about how we can close the gap. How can we get them closer to where their peers are? So for goal setting, the first step is to determine the end date of the period when you're going to progress monitor. So it could be that that's the end of the year, it could be the end of the semester, the end date could be the end of the IEP cycle. So, it could be that the end date is 36 weeks from the point you're at, the number of weeks in a school year. So you're going to first determine that end date, then you're going to determine the level at which you expect the student to perform at the end of the period. So again, we want it to be ambitious but realistic, and that level will be the student's long-term goal. And we're going to look at this just a little bit more. So there are two general methods that we use for setting goals. We can set them using benchmarks, we can set them using weekly rates of improvement. Both methods have strengths for students who are struggling, and in some cases, either one might be better for a particular student that you're working with. So if we're using the benchmark method, if we have collected a student's baseline data in the fall, then we might use the winter or spring, so either middle of year or end of year benchmarks to create our goal. And these benchmarks are sometimes called norms. They're established via the performance of the general population. So they're available through the company that you selected your measures from, and they're established levels of performance at which most students in a grade level typically perform at that time of year. And so you can pick like the spring benchmark for 4th grade, and that's the level you would use for your end goal for your particular student. Another way that we set goals for students is using a weekly rate of improvement, and sometimes we call that rate of improvement an ROI. It's just the acronym we use, so you might have heard ROI before. This method can be used if the student's IEP date doesn't align well with winter or spring. Maybe it's sort of mid-semester, maybe it's midway through fall and spring, and so we might want to instead multiply the weekly rate of improvement by the number of weeks until the end and add that score to the baseline. Both get you this end point, but in the first case, using benchmarks, you're using an end rate that's already established. Using weekly rates of improvement, you're multiplying a weekly rate times the number of weeks until you want to discontinue progress monitoring, and you're adding that to the baseline. So let's see some examples of how this would work with some students. So first, here's an example. This is Max. He's a 3rd grader. Currently, he reads 60 words at baseline on the Dibbles Oral Reading Fluency. That's DORF, Dibbles Oral Reading Fluency. When we look at where typical 3rd graders usually perform at so if we look over here, 3rd graders at the beginning of the year, typically they perform, their recommended benchmark goal is in the green. The cut point for risk is in the white, okay? So green is where we would hope they would be. White is where, if they're not to that point, there would likely be some risk for that particular student. So if we look up here for 3rd grade, the beginning of the year, the middle of the year, the end of the year. At the beginning of the year, students typically in 3rd grade are scoring 97 on oral reading fluency. The cut point for risk would be 72. If students are lower than 72, they might be at risk. At the end of middle of year, it scoops up to 115 and then 123 at the end of the year. So let's think back to Max. Max is reading right now 60 words, and it's the beginning of the year, okay? So let's go back to our sheet. We know that 3rd graders, and Max is 3rd grade, right? Okay, let's go back to our norms or benchmarks for our program. At the beginning of the year, let's see where Max should be. Max, typical students, 97. Students, the cut point for risk, 72. Okay, Max is at 60. So what do you think? Right now, if a cut point for risk is 72 at the beginning of the year, Max is at 60. Max at risk or not? What do you think? Yeah, he's at risk right now because he scored, right now he's 12 below where our cut point for risk is. And he's actually 37 words off of where typically, where students are at the beginning of the year. So just as I just illustrated, yeah, Max is definitely at risk right now. So what benchmark should we have Max shoot for? Where should the teacher set benchmark level for Max? So the end of the year is 123. That would be a third grade end of the year. Even though Max is at risk right now for the beginning of the year, we might consider moving ahead and actually setting that end of the year goal similar to where we think he should be with his peers. We would want to look at his accuracy though. Even though he's reading 60 words correctly, we'd want to make sure that he's reading accurately. If his accuracy is below 90%, we might want to consider reducing that goal just a little bit. So here's what his goal would look like as we articulate it. By the end of the year, Max will read at least 123 words correctly in 1 minute on 2 consecutive third grade oral reading fluency forms while maintaining 90% or better accuracy. So that could be his IEP goal, that could be the goal we set for Max, for intervention, but that's how we would articulate that goal. Okay. If we were using rate of improvement instead, in the DIBELS oral reading fluency, they suggest for third grade that we have an ROI of 1.5 or greater. So this would be for goal setting for students who are off grade level. This would be an ambitious rate of improvement, okay? So suggestion of 1.5 or greater. Remember, rate of improvement, we're gonna multiply that times the number of weeks that Max is gonna be in the progress monitoring routine and add that to our baseline to determine that goal. Okay, so let's do that math here. So let's assume we decide rate of improvement of 2 is good for Max. Remember we said it should be 1.5 or greater. We decide that Max should increase 2 words per week, and we're going to deliver 16 more weeks of instruction. Then we would add our Max's baseline right here. We take the ROI times the number of weeks, so we've got our rate of improvement we said was 2 times the number of weeks, so that would be 32, added to 60, and Max's long range goal would be 92. By the date, Max will read 92 words read correctly per minute using third grade DIBELS oral reading fluency for 2 consecutive data points with that 90% or better accuracy. So you can see sort of the difference in goal setting. This goal setting method, rate of improvement, might be more precise or more tailored to individual students. When we looked at the goal setting for just choosing an end of the year goal, so here those were over here, 123, those are based on established norms that are set for students, so it might not be quite as tailored to an individual student. And now you're going to give it a try on your own. We're going to set an end of the year benchmark for Anna. Anna's a 5th grade student. Her baseline in the beginning of the year on DIBELS oral reading fluency was 95 words correct per minute. Below here you see the 5th grade norms for oral reading fluency, beginning, middle, end of year. Remember that top box in green is the benchmark. The bottom box is like the cut point for risk. So I want you to stop and jot down and then share with a partner. Is she at risk? 1, is Anna at risk based on her baseline beginning score? And then what would be her goal for the end of the year? Okay, so take a minute to do that. Okay. So I hope you found that by the end of the year, Anna will read 155 or more words correct per minute on 2 consecutive double oral reading fluency probes while maintaining 90% or better accuracy. That is the 5th grade end of the year score. And I hope that you also talked about her risk status. She was at 95 at the beginning. That's below the 103 risk cut. So at the beginning of the year, she definitely was at risk, and we hope to get her up to this 155 by the end of the year. So I mentioned earlier, we want to continue to think about accuracy as well. We want our accuracy goals, so the percentage of words read correctly, to target 95%. 90% would be sort of a minimum cut. DIBELS has actually suggested accuracy goals as well. So for 3rd grade students, 99% accurate. A cut point for risk would be 96, 97, 98, sort of those increasing levels of accuracy that are necessary to not be at risk as they go throughout the year. And accuracy goals would be good for students who attempt to read quickly and make many mistakes, who are, for instance, students who routinely guess. But you should continue to keep track of words correct per minute, even if employing an accuracy goal. So you should graph both, number of words read correct per minute and that accuracy if you're concerned about that. But accuracy is a good way. Sometimes we feel like in our classes we have word callers. Some students who sort of can read like crazy but aren't very accurate. We might want to keep track of accuracy goals for those particular students.